Thank you everyone for coming. This is such an amazing turnout. I feel so blessed to see all of these wonderful faces and for all of you to be here. I feel so supported. This has been the most amazing year for me in terms of art. It's been a 6-year journey, coming from not having, been able to do art because of my children being in the house and spending my money mostly for my children, and really trying to be a mother. And Donna, you're very familiar in that kind of situation. And a lot of artists, Annie too, we're familiar with that kind of situation where you put everything into your children and you don't have time for your art. But over the last 6 years, I have really turned the corner. My children are older, and I have been able to pour myself into my art. I'm gonna keep the mask. My mother is asking should I take my mask off, but I'm gonna keep it on because I think it's safer if I have my mask on too. Is everybody comfortable with that? Okay. I'm a Black American woman. I am the descendant of an enslaved African who escaped slavery with his wife, daughter, and son. My ancestors are educators, entrepreneurs, and I have become the descendants of them through all of what they have poured into me. My ancestors are civil rights activists. They're often the only Black people in the room and in the circles that they move within. I'm an artist, advocate, and mentor, and through my art practice, I advocate for social justice with stories about belonging, identity, equity, and social norms. The history of my ancestors informs what I do in my life, my art, and how I interact with people. Why is this important? Because history tells us about the present, and it tells us what's happening now. What you see, Black girls need less nurturing. Black girls need less protection. Black girls need to be supported less. Black girls need to be comforted less. Black girls are more independent. Black girls know more about adult topics. Black girls know more about sex. What we see, a Black girl was arrested in school in Hawaii over a drawing that upset a parent. A teen Black girl was body slammed by a Florida school resource officer for no apparent reason. What you see, Black boys are perceived as older, mischievous, viewed as guilty or suspect of crime. They face police violence if accused of a crime. What we see, a young 6-year-old was arrested for picking a tulip while he was waiting for the school bus. A Black teen was arrested on a roadway during a Texas winter storm because he wasn't walking on the sidewalk. What you see, Black people have thicker skin. Black people's nerve endings feel less than whites. What we see, Black women are 6 times more likely to die from pregnancy complications. What we see is that Black teens are less likely to receive the proper pain medication after slavery as compared to whites.
Surgery.
Propaganda, specifically negative images, was disseminated by white Americans to destroy the validity of Black American character and to justify the violent treatment of Black bodies and normalize their exclusion from society. There are typical negative characters that were talked about widely and disseminated in caricatures by whites throughout America. Some of those are known as Sapphire, And today we call her the angry Black woman. We also had the Black brute. He was the intimidating, disgruntled, non-cooperative Black man. And today, when you see a Black man walking down the street, you think of him often as being disruptive. Pickaninnies was the depiction of the young Black child. Mangy, distrustful, mischievous children. And today, we know from what I just said, that Black children are perceived as older, more mischievous, and mangy. In order to own up to our own history, we need to know about it. And that was the impetus behind me doing this piece. The question became, how can I depict this history and its effects in a way that draws people in and creates a desire to become educated and to push the paradigm for change? Enculturation is a process by which a person adopts the behavior patterns of their culture. I want to talk now about this piece. Some of you here have been able to see it, and online we will link you later on to the resource where you can read more about the piece. My overall reaching desire for this piece was to explain how these negative images have caused the American society to view Black people. When you come up to the piece, when you're looking at it in person, at first you think that you're supposed to be looking at it from the front. But I really wanted you to take away the normalcy of when you come up to something originally, you come to the front. And you're meant to look at it from the sides, the top, and just the sides and the top, to focus on the negative images, but with the danger tape going over it, I want you to understand that if you focus on them too much, they become real again. Danger, do not enter, is meant for you to understand that if you really look too deeply, you begin to take back in those images. At the back of the piece, and a warning right now, this is a little bit triggering. I was telling my mother about it, she said, oh! The flag is called the Niggerland flag. And it's meant to talk about how the propaganda over generations infiltrated into the African, enslaved African. When you look at the piece, you can see me dressed in actually this colonial attire that I'm wearing. And I start off in a diffused position, so it's muted, you can't see it as strongly. And then it goes deeper and deeper, and you can see me more prominently. And it's to show how that indoctrination over generation, over generation, over generation grew and grew and grew. So the belief that you had that your family and your culture in Africa was good and right and you belonged there, over the generations, you lose that. And you start to believe that European way of life is better. A star is meant to show people a guide. The North Star showed people how to escape from slavery. And in the American flag, we have the stars and the stripes. The star here that I created is meant to depict the enslaved Africans on the ship. And I used myself in the nude multiple times over and over and over again to depict the crowded conditions that they were on the ship. But also in the nude to show the innocence that you have when you're in the nude, not knowing what was going to be happening when they got to this new land, and not having any information about what the European expected of them. At the top of the star, there are points, 4 points sticking out, and it's me dressed in Afrofuturistic attire. Afrofuturism, for those of you that do not know, is an art form that was developed by African Americans in the United States, and it depicts this idea that there is no ceiling to what we can do. The future is great. I'm dressed in Afrofuturistic attire to show that I'm standing on the shoulders of my ancestors, reaching for a ceiling that I hope will not hold me back. I also used red, green, black, and yellow, which depict for the Black American flag. Black for the people, red for the blood that was shed, green for the land, and gold for the riches that were taken from Africa. The flag also represents the colonization movement that happened in the early 1800s with a group of white men that believed that freed Black Americans, freed Black slaves, could not live and coexist with whites. So they decided that they needed to ship these Blacks back to Africa. And they went on a search to find land where they could reside. And they discovered modern-day Liberia. And they purchased it for a small amount of money, about $300. But it wasn't in cash. It didn't help them to grow their wealth. They purchased it for rum and small, ridiculous items like that. They shipped all these free Africans back to Africa. And when they got there, most of them perished because they had been living in the United States for so long and they were not used to the conditions. But the ones that survived colonized the local indigenous people there because they had been indoctrinated to believe that the European way of life was the only way of life. They had been indoctrinated to believe that Africans didn't know anything. And even to this day, in Liberia, the America Liberian is in the leading class. They are more wealthy than the indigenous Liberians. In fact, the first indigenous Liberian person became president recently. When you come around to the front of the piece, after you've taken all of this tremendous, horrible information in, I wanted you to look at yourself. On the front of the piece, it says, look at yourself, what do you see? Are you looking at yourself? Is it really yourself? Did you create that self or did society create that? Did your parent create that? If you're a woman, did society tell you that you should be a certain way? If you're a man, did society say you shouldn't cry or feel emotional or have feelings? What is the self that you are carrying? And when you look at that, do you want to make any changes? Also remembering that enculturation is the process by which a person adopts the behavior and patterns of their culture. So yourself is a pattern of your culture. Along the outside, written along the outside of the piece, is a poem by Phyllis Wheatley, which I'm going to read to you. Phyllis Wheatley was the first published African American. She was brilliant, a poet. But she was a product of this indoctrination. She writes in her poem, on being brought, the title of the poem is called On Being Brought from Africa to America. 'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God and there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew, some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train. As brilliant as she was, she had lost a culture. She didn't know that there's a history of writers and artists and just philosophers in Africa. She only understood that Africa was pagan and that by joining the Christian fold, all Negroes can be reformed. When you open up the piece now, you're going to have this act of opening up the door. Everything about this piece is meant to be interactive because the more you move and the more you do and the more you connect that movement to your brain, the act of doing changes the reality. When you open the door, you'll see visually the curtain is generally closed. I have it open so you can see both the inside and the outside. But the closed curtain is meant to protect the interior from the exterior. The exterior is all of those negative images that are constantly bombarding the Black people. Those negative images that affect us on a daily basis. I've lined, before you open the curtain, lining the anteroom is a crest that my father had commissioned in the 80s. Yeah, you have a question? Sorry.
It just says, can we have a screen larger instead of the camera on you? I can hear it.
Tech guy. One second, everybody.
Oh, so can they see me?
Can you take her up? There's remove from screen.
Removed from screen.
Yeah.
There.
You good?
Says your audio is
Maybe you could be a little. I don't think I can do it.
No, this just shows the screen. It just shows the screen, not you.
Okay. So that's perfect.
Okay.
So this crest that my dad had commissioned in the 80s, it's a source of pride for our family, but it also reflects a loss of culture. A crest symbolizes the family. It tells what the generations of the family had behind them, and it also talks about going forward. This crest that he designed meant the world to us. However, as I said, it showed a loss of culture. If we lived in Africa, what we would be showing in terms of our family might be a braid style, might be a beautiful jewelry, might be patterns that are on the fabric that we have. But my father didn't have that information because we've been here for generations. So he took all that he knew, which was a European concept, to depict our family. I'm going to read you a little bit of the notes from his handwritten notes from when he was designing the crest. 2 lions, regal symbols of Africa, the motherland. One representing the Patterson lineage, the initiator of the family crest. The other representing all those many lineages who before and after joined with us to strengthen the destiny and dynasty for eternal life. This was such a great endeavor for him, and it's meant in my piece to protect the interior of the piece. Once you open the curtain, you are visibly seeing all of the beautiful images of Black people. So we started off with the negative images. We started off understanding what happens with enculturation, what happens with the propaganda, and how the propaganda over generations affected Black people. The curtain being drawn showed that we don't want to be affected by that all the time. But you open up the curtain and whoa, lo and behold, all of these beautiful images that are that are showing the pride that we have. They're showing the glory that we have. For me, growing up as a Black woman, a Black girl, in a predominantly white neighborhood, predominantly white school, and a dominant white culture, I looked for things that could show me pride. And those things were my family, and looking to other people who were doing amazing things, like activists and artists and writers. And I wanted to show all of that in here. Publications that were written by Black people. What were these amazing things that we were doing? Opening that curtain for someone who isn't Black, again, we're going back to this act of doing things. When you physically open the curtain, you're having to change the paradigm for yourself. You're having to think about, what does that look like to look inside a place that Black people hold sacred, that they don't want people to step into? If you can take away those negative images, open the curtain, and see only those positive images, you can affect the change. I want to talk to you a little bit about my process for making this piece. I'm gonna just. Yes.
Comment, so perhaps better screen light to distinguish the picture. So the narrative is excellent.
I don't know if we can get more for them.
You might be able to brighten the screen on your computer.
Maybe. That's a good idea.
Yeah, I don't think you can fix that now.
Okay. For me, when I'm developing a piece, I'm scribbling lots of notes of paper all over the place. And for years, I had stacks of paper all over my house. Sometimes I couldn't find them. I wouldn't necessarily know where they are. This year, I discovered Google Docs.
Yeah.
This was the best thing ever for me as an artist. Now I have a folder for each piece I'm working on, and inside that folder I have multiple folders. So these were some sketches that I started with when I was making the piece. I wanted to plan out in my head what it would look like. I purchased the box empty from Evanston Rebuild. And the reason why I want to mention that is because, like I said, my art is to showcase marginalized people. And Evanston Rebuild, they have an amazing program where they help formerly incarcerated people to get jobs. They train them in apprenticeship and they help them get jobs. And they also help low-income teens go into apprenticeship and get jobs. So for me, it was important that I'm using something that I don't have to, number one, is already, it's there. I don't want to make more pollution for the world. And then second of all, that I'm giving back to an organization that also is focused on marginalized people. There's actually a picture of what the box looked like before. As I began to look and think about what I wanted to do, I originally thought that I wanted to have the pieces enmeshed in the mirror so that you looked at the negative pictures and then you looked at yourself. But I thought about it, and like I've discussed, I didn't want the images to be the first thing that you see. I wanted that to be a part of the history, but not the focus in a sense. So I had these iterations with aluminum foil and crayons to kind of plot out what I was going to do. I began to collect the negative images in my Google Doc in my folder and deciding what felt like it needed to be shown and what felt like it didn't need to be shown. What I realized is that there's so much to talk about that I couldn't even begin to put it all in my piece. But I really wanted to show that the demoralization that came from these images, how these images showed Black people as animals, as disgruntled, lazy people, because that is informing how people are seeing Black people to this day, unfortunately. The caution tape and the danger tape were really important because I wanted it to be like a red flag. Red flag is like danger, danger, Will Robinson. Don't look at these images, but look at them because we don't want to repeat history. I'm a collaborative artist, and I like to ask questions, and I like to get help. To do the inside of the piece, to make this curtain and to figure out how to put it in, I needed help. I had to go to vendors that could tell me how much fabric I needed. I had to go to a tailor to figure out how to sew this. And I had to figure out how to put a little tiny curtain rod inside this space and how to make it go open and close. It was a lot to take on. I ended up finding on the internet some things that could help me when I go to these vendors and say, this is what I'm attempting to do. How can you help me do this? This is a very helpful process for me because what you see and what I see is different. No pun intended to the piece. I think we saw that. Mm-hmm. This part for me was magical. I started with the center idea of my family. As I said, for me, family was a source of pride for me. My family, my mother and my father, they had African artwork around our house. They started an African American heritage school when I was younger, which my mother was the principal of. We had a strong foundation of what it meant to be have pride as an African American. But not everyone has that. Not everyone as a Black person has that stability, has that sense of pride and family that I have. But I wanted to show the greatness and the beauty of the African American, and I started with my family. And then other families like the Obamas. And I also wanted to show activism. My grandmother was an activist. She marched with Martin Luther King, and she helped to make changes in the school system in South Carolina. My dad was owned the first Black brokerage firm on Wall Street. All of these are a sense of pride for me. And I wanted to show that when you open up the curtain, I wanted you to see and to feel the pride coming through there. On the back when I was trying to figure out what I was gonna do to close off the back of this piece, because there was a hole there, since it's really meant to be the frame of a window. And at first I said, okay, I'm gonna use found objects, because again, that's part of what I wanna do, is not add more trash to the world. And I started piling up, as you can see, pieces of wood. And it fit perfectly in the shape. However, what I didn't know, because I'm not a woodworker, is that when you put random pieces of wood together, you do not create a straight plane. Once I got them all together, I spent weeks with this jigsaw puzzle trying to put it together. And then when I got it together, I was like, this is not gonna work. It's not gonna stay, it's gonna tip over. I had to trash that idea. As an artist, sometimes you go through an iteration, spend lots of time, and it ends up not being working out or being in the piece. I also needed to figure out about the flag. What did that look like? And I told you before, I mentioned before, that I take notes and scribble all over when I have these ideas. They're generating all the time, sometimes so fast that I can't even control what's coming in my mind. And I used a scrap piece of paper and I did 6 iterations of a flag. I started doing this idea of a flag several years ago and I made 6 iterations. And when it came down to the time to actually make the flag, none of them made sense for this piece. So I had to regroup. I started with the idea of the Black national flag, which is the black, red, and green. But then I felt like that's a little too obvious. What's the story that I'm telling here? And how can I tell it in a nuanced way as opposed to slapping you in the face with something obvious? I ended up using the ideas of the American flag and the ideas of the Liberian flag. The Liberian flag is almost exactly the same as the American flag. And that is because they felt so tied to America. That indoctrination that they had made them believe that they were actually almost like Americans. So if you look at the Liberian flag, and you look at the American flag, the differences are minor. There are less stars on the Liberian flag. So I wanted to show that in this flag, but I also wanted to show the hardship that the enslaved Africans went through, and show where we're going to. I think that's it. Once I figured out exactly what all of these things were going to look like, I thought, well, how am I going to get it to stand up? I knew that it was going to be at this public art exhibition, and I knew that people needed to come by and see it, but how am I going to get this window box to stand up? So I went around Evanston, looking around and sneaking in people's yards and taking pictures. I came up with this idea to make it similar to the library boxes. Now Lisa, when I came here to put this in, I also came and did some measurements. If you look at the next slide actually, on. I came and I measured, I went and took pictures so I could see where the piece was going to go. I had my older son come with me and we measured the height of the piece, and the Home Depot person told me how deep the stand needed to go into the ground. Felt like everything was going to be under control. And then the day that I came to put the piece in, my 3rd child, poor child, he had to dig 3 feet holes. We were in the dark with a light shining on him so he could keep digging. So the best laid plans aren't always the way they are meant to be, but that's part of art as well. We finally got it in, and I've had such great reception to this piece. I've had such a great turnout today. I'm so thankful for all of you guys coming. I want to talk to you a little bit about my next adventure. This piece, when I was making it, was really cathartic for me. A necessary part of my commitment to shed light on the history of the propaganda against Black people and help to create a society where we can all heal. I believe that racial healing comes when we all feel belonging and that we are giving and being a part of society. And I wanted this piece to be a part of that, a part of racial healing. My next adventure is that I'm off to Mexico for 5 weeks. I am going to be living in Puebla, Mexico for 5 weeks and traveling through Mexico. A little known fact about Puebla, Mexico was that it was the second largest city in the New Spain. There were 20,000 bills of slave purchase that are archived in Puebla, Mexico. I plan over the course of these 5 weeks, to be digging into those archives and learning more about the history of Afro-Mexicans and the history of what happened, of the effects of chattel slavery. I plan to move throughout the country to the different coastal areas where the Afro-Mexicans live today. Most of them are on the coastal areas because that's where they were brought in on the ships. They helped to build Mexico City, and that's why Puebla became a very important and large center area where Blacks were living. Because to get from the coastal area, you had to pass through Puebla to get to Mexico City. So they would go into Puebla, pick up supplies, and head into Mexico City. So I'll be starting in Mexico City, where I'm going to be visiting one of the museums that has the Casta paintings. The Casta paintings were developed because the Spaniards believed in mixing, different from the American way that we believed it was against the law to mix. And the Spaniards believed in mixing as a way of subjugation. The Casta paintings depict this mixing that they allowed. So you have a Spaniard and an Indian is a mestizo. You have a Spaniard and an African is a mulatto. And you have then a mestizo and a mulatto beget something else. A Spaniard and a mulatto beget something else. And the idea is to get all the way to the top to be as white as possible. But they teach this doctrine that says we're all the same. It twists your mind to think that if we're all the same, then there is no racism. But the Afro-Mexicans are still marginalized and treated disproportionately wrong and different. On my trip, I will also be going to the only museum in Mexico that is centered around the Afro-Mexican community. I have a great adventure planned, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to come back and shed light on the effects that chattel slavery had in the African diaspora, different and similar to what my own experience was and that of the African American. Historically, kings and queens and wealthy families funded visual artists, and magnificent creations were made. I'm asking all of you to be my patrons. Please consider becoming my patron. Whether you give financially or a kudo on the back, I would be so grateful. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you. I'm open for questions.
As you were immersing yourself in the negative images in the course of doing this work, I would imagine that those negative images would have a very depressing effect after a time. So how did you cope with that? Or how did you deal with processing, having to force yourself to look at these negative images?
Yeah, it was difficult. And especially even this morning, when I was going over what I was going to be saying and talking about, and saying these things about the children being body slammed. It's so emotional. It's hard to deal with, but the larger point about doing it is to have these conversations, to spread the information and the knowledge. If we keep that all quiet, we won't grow from it, and we won't change. And we won't know. You wouldn't know that the reason why these things are happening is because of these negative images, because we don't see that so much anymore. But over time, they just become enculturated into society, and you don't know that you're being told these things subliminally.
Mhm.
So yes, it was hard, but there are lots of processes that my mother taught me to get negative things out, and one of them is just doing this. It might seem a little hippy dippy, but it
You mentioned that in one of the parts you felt that creating all the images, the positive images were very magical for you. Did you have a favorite part of the creation of your art? And if so, which one was it?
Yeah, my favorite part was actually the flag.
Okay.
It was because it was actually several years in the making. You know, I took the pictures about 2 years ago, and being able to incorporate all the different components of it and bringing it together and finding a place where I could print a waterproof fabric. It just was like, it felt so good that I could be able to bring this to life that took so many years for me to be able to figure out.
Sorry.
Yes.
Is this piece typical of your work, or how does it fit into your development and as an artist and the work that I can see a relationship with the work perhaps you're heading to do.
Yeah. So I come from an art background, as I said, but I haven't been able to really express my art because of family commitments. I was inspired as a teenager in one of the schools that I went to by an art professor who showed me how to do research and connect my art with research and things that were coming that I wanted to explore. And I started that initially before I had children, moving in that direction, and then wasn't able to continue. And 6 years ago, with a frustration about not being able to create, I picked up a camera. And that was the way I was expressing art for several years. But my true identity as an artist is working with wood and paper and glass and combining found objects, assemblage type of pieces. So this is really kind of coming back full circle for me. And it feels really great. Yeah, it feels really great.
Thank you.
As one of your other projects, it seems to you were doing some interviews.
Yes.
And making podcasts of those. And are you going to also be interviewing people in Mexico and adding that to your art?
I am going to be doing interviews. Some of you who have been following my journey know that I actually was supposed to have an exhibit just before the pandemic started. And I was working on a project, full disclosure, this is gonna be a little jarring again, called the Nigger Project. And this is interviews with young people, 3 generations post-civil rights, on how they feel about the N-word. And I did portraits and interviewed them, and they also wrote out their own essay about their feelings of it. And I'm working on that now, and you can come see it in December in my salon. I will have a small iteration of that. And maybe Lisa and I will talk about a larger one. So yes, it'll be similar to that, where I will be interviewing Afro-Mexicans, taking portraits, collecting archival objects, archaeological objects of their community, finding these archives that I mentioned that are in Puebla, Mexico, and then putting that all together and figuring out what that piece is. Another piece that I have in the back of my head is called Who's at the Table? And this is with a found object that I have. Someone is giving away a 1950s Formica kitchen table. And as you can see, my process takes time, but the ideas are churning. So going back to what you were saying, coming full circle to assemblage work.
Yeah, it's just a comment. I think who's at the table is a profound idea, and it has so many meanings on so many levels.
Yes, exactly. Any questions from online?
No, just comments saying, great talk, excellent content.
Thank you. All right, everyone, I thank you so much for coming. And